Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Cluster munitions will change nothing for Ukraine. The Biden administration has announced that it will be authorizing a new tranche of military support for Ukraine. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the U.S. has, prior to the recent announcement, refused to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine for one simple reason. Much of the world, including many of America's NATO allies, views cluster munitions as representing an unacceptable risk to civilian life due to the high occurrence of dud munitions, or munitions that fail to detonate on impact. As a result, cluster munitions continue to kill long after the battle where they were employed has ended. The victims tend to be civilians who stumble upon these munitions and inadvertently set them off. Dr. Horne, I don't know that cluster munitions are going to be a game changer on the battlefield. They will be a game changer once the war is over to, again, those civilians that happen to innocently stumble upon them. Why, particularly after even Joe Biden saying previously that cluster bombs or using them are war crimes, he has acquiesced at this point?
I think it bespeaks the desperation of U.S. imperialism and its NATO allies, a desperation which will be on full view in Vilnius, Lithuania, this week when NATO meets. Interestingly enough, Lithuania happens to be the most anti-Beijing European nation extant today. However, I do think as well that this is a significant human rights crisis. That is to say that these so-called cluster munitions are akin to landmines, which you may recall that the late Princess Diana campaigned against vigorously because they were used so promiscuously by U.S. allies, particularly in southern Angola, particularly during the wars for liberation. And that has helped to create a generation of amputees, particularly youthful amputees to this very day, who stumble over them. Clearly, this sending of cluster munitions to the theater of conflict in Ukraine helps to blemish the already blemished reputation of U.S. imperialism with regard to human rights. It also points up the splits in the coalition. Annalena Baerbock, the hawkish German foreign minister, came out against this dispatching, as has Congresswoman Barbara Lee of the Congressional Black Caucus, now enmeshed in a failing campaign to become the next U.S. senator from the Golden State, replacing Dianne Feinstein. I should also say that this sending of cluster munitions to this theater of conflict also shows that Washington may be involved in a kind of last-ditch Hail Mary before the roof falls in. The roof falling in meaning a generational defeat in Ukraine, which will obviously call into question the very existence of NATO, an avowedly anti-Moscow organization. Simultaneously, one can make an argument, to use another well-worn U.S. metaphor, that a defeat in Ukraine in many ways exposes how the United States, as the musicians say, has been faking the funk. That is to say that even the most somnolent member of the U.S. ruling class knows that China is the ball game, that China is the big enchilada, and yet the United States is mucking around in Ukraine, confronting what their spokespersons have derided as a gas station masquerading as a country, which makes one wonder, well, why are they spending so much time and effort on this gas station masquerading as a country, as a great power? And I think in terms of faking the buck, perhaps they're afraid to go toe-to-toe with China. And so therefore, this detour in Ukraine serves their cynical interests.
Former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating has made an interesting statement, which is titled "NATO's Provocative Lurch Eastward and the Supreme Fool Jens Stoltenberg." And the most interesting statement that he made was talking about NATO moving to moving to the Pacific region. He says exporting that malicious poison to Asia would be akin to Asia welcoming the plague upon itself. Strong words from a former Australian Prime Minister. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Yes. However, those of us who keep a close eye on Australian politics are not surprised. Paul Keating has been a stern critic of the anti-Beijing policies that have been ginned up by Australia's erstwhile ally, speaking of the United States, followed by current Australian Foreign Minister, Mr. Albanese, who also happens to be of the same political party as Paul Keating, speaking of the Labour Party. But perhaps Mr. Albanese has happened to view the Hollywood film starring Sean Penn, The Falcon and the Snowman, which I recommend to your audience. It depicts what happened a few decades ago when U.S. imperialism sought to destabilize Australian government because it was seen as insufficiently hawkish with regard to the U.S. escapade in Vietnam. I dare say that this U.S. manipulation of Australian politics continues to this very day. Now that Paul Keating is safely out of office, he can raise a ruckus. Mr. Albanese, the current prime minister, is apparently not so endowed, but that is the overlay helping to shape that very arresting comment from the former Australian leader.
So as we look at the most recent turns in Ukraine, and we know we have this NATO meeting on the horizon, what really is there for them to discuss? They've already decided Britain's already providing depleted uranium. So I guess they're going to pollute the soil for who knows how long, how many generations to come. They now want to send in cluster munitions to pollute the soil for who knows how long. What is there really for them to discuss? Oh, and let me add one more thing. And Joe Biden's now saying, well, you know what? I think we need to move Ukraine over to the Israeli plan and give them $4 billion a year in hard-earned American taxpayer dollars.
Well, it's clear that U.S. imperialism is facing a major crisis. They have limited options, amongst which is pushing this entire planet to the point of nuclear annihilation. I would not necessarily rule that out, though it may seem unlikely to many in your audience. And then, of course, there's the other option, which seemingly is being pursued, the option of the frozen conflict, whereby you use Ukrainians as pawns on a chessboard to try to tie down Russia indefinitely into the next decade, so that Russia will not be able to play a robust role with regard to its alliance with its neighbor, speaking of China. Right now, it seems that the latter option is being pursued. The tragedy, amongst others, is that the Ukrainian leadership apparently is going along with being pawns in a larger game. Obviously, the Ukrainian people are the major loser.
Let me ask one more quick question. In listening to you, when you started talking about nuclear annihilation, maybe they figure if we blow it up, we can make a whole lot of money rebuilding it. It'll be a global Marshall Plan. They did it during World War II. Maybe they figure if we blow up the world, we can revitalize the U.S. economy by rebuilding it.
Well, it would not surprise me if the harebrained in Washington were coming up with such a diabolical, devilish scheme. However, someone should pull their coats and apprise them of what is called nuclear fallout. That is to say, if you detonate a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or, heaven forfend, in Russia, the nuclear fallout will inevitably impact the United States of America, just like you see in your newspapers today that air and air that happens to be polluted due to imperialism and colonialism is wafting across the Atlantic to Florida. Imagine what happens with regard to nuclear radiation wafting across the Pacific.
Speaking of the Pacific, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited China. There, she tried to press the world's biggest economy on several issues. Yellen's visit to China has failed, according to the Moon of Alabama. Dr. Horne.
Well, she had a difficult brief to argue. That is to say, Secretary Yellen was dispatched to Beijing to clean up the unfortunate remarks of President Biden, her supervisor, who referred to the Chinese leader as a dictator after finagling a meeting by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, which obviously China was unwilling to host. So therefore, you see that Secretary Yellen has moved away from the notion of the United States decoupling from the Chinese economy or even de-risking, to use the Brussels phrasing. Now she just talks about diversifying. I'm not sure what the next phrase will be, but obviously they're trying to climb down from the exposed position in which they were found. Secretary Yellen also has the difficult brief to argue, encouraging and enticing China to continue to make loans to the U.S. Treasury so that the U.S. government will not collapse and so that workers from the post office to the Pentagon can continue to be paid. And so this is a very difficult brief to argue. On the one hand, you have generals in Washington clamoring about a war with China in the next 15 to 18 months. On the other hand, you see Secretary Yellen with her begging bowl touring Beijing, asking the Chinese leaders to drop coins in it. I do not envy her position, and I dare say that unless, once again, Washington is contemplating nuclear annihilation, similar to Ukraine, they are facing a monumental generational setback and defeat.
We have just about a minute and a half left. Can we make anything out of who the Chinese decide to speak to and who they don't? Tony Blinken had to go. He spent basically, I think, 9.5 hours begging, and then they finally granted him a meeting with President Xi. Janet Yellen seemed to be welcome, and from what I've understood, they don't even want to talk to Lloyd Austin. So they don't like him. They don't trust him. They see him as don't come over here telling us about imperialism, Mr. Imperialist. Do we take anything away from who they see and who they don't?
Well, like your audience, I think China recognizes that the State Department is the hawk with regard to many diplomatic incidents around the world, including Ukraine, for example. Mr. Austin, by definition, is a hawk. He heads the Department of War. Secretary Yellen holds the checkbook, and therefore China is willing to talk with her because she's not from state nor from defense.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.